Welcome to Energy 360, The Transition, a CSIS miniseries exploring the energy implications of Donald Trump's victory in the 2024 election. This week, Joseph and I discuss the incoming Trump administration's strategy for the U.S. oil and gas industry with two top experts. Victoria Coates is Vice President of the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. She previously served as the Deputy National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump. Kevin Book is the Managing Director of Clearview Energy Partners and a non-resident senior advisor with CSIS's Energy Security and Climate Change Program. Let's dive in. On day one, President Trump and his new administration are going to go forth with drill, baby, drill. This will probably involve a whole bunch of executive orders. I'm curious what happens on day two, Kevin. What should we be looking for on day two, day three, day four when it comes to American oil and gas? Investor probably first. We've got the rocks. Will we have the money? If regulations roll back, it improves the cost structure, makes it more attractive. The Biden administration has been leasing parcels that have been more fragmented, less frequently at higher cost. Change that, you create an option but not an obligation. So I think what we get from Washington will be a lot of questions, but what we get from operators themselves in response, also questions. Victoria, what does drill, baby, drill mean to you this time around?
Well, I think it means a much more sort of concerted, strategic approach to developing and deploying U.S. energy resources. And I think the appointment of Governor Bergen to not be Secretary of Energy, but to be the Secretary of the Interior, for the reasons Kevin was just discussing, is a critical signal that what are they going to be looking at most aggressively are permitting and licensing authorities, which is, of course, sit in Interior. And so I think that is a major signal that we've gotten from the new administration that we are going after that architecture very specifically.
Joseph, this is an interesting point that Victoria makes here, placing Governor Burgum in that particular perch at DOI, but also putting him in charge of the National Energy Council. What does this signal to you?
I think it signals a desire to align the expertise in the government with actual performance, right? So traditionally, you have different functions spread out throughout the government. Treasury makes tax policy. DOE does science and innovation. Interior manages our public lands. And to develop a strategic approach to avoid the pitfalls that have stalled the progress of other administrations, that's kind of like horizontal arguments, turf wars between different departments. You might need somebody empowered like a czar or a head of this council. The fact that that person is also a secretary means they have a lot more clout, I would say, than they would if they were just working within the White House.
Putting some muscle behind the thoughts. So same framework really as the Secretary of State being the chair of the International Development Finance Corporation, right? Connecting the thinkers and the doers.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Kevin. So I think there's a big emphasis on the geopolitical role and significance of U.S. oil and gas. At least it seems like the incoming Trump administration is really eager to use the American energy dominance that we've achieved since last time that they were in the White House. I'm curious, what are the opportunities when it comes to U.S. oil and gas production, and also the risks of using these things as geopolitical tools?
I'm glad you used the D word, right? Dominance. No, seriously, the goal of independence, aspirational like dominance, but independence is about security. Dominance is about market share. And if you look at the 15 years through 2023, so we have been essentially very dominant. U.S. supply growth, 88% of global consumption growth, and essentially buffered the world. It's created more price stability so that when we look at major geopolitical turbulence, we don't end up with the price spikes of yesteryear. Now, you ask, what are the risks of this? Well, the U.S. government doesn't control the private entities that are responsible for the investment and the production. And while we can influence and shape from Washington, what happens in the oil patch still reflects practical reality.
Victoria, you were in the thick of the geopolitics of energy in the last administration. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the opportunities and risks are for Trump 2.0.
Yeah, there's a really different world picture, Quill, because what we have now are Russia and Iran very very openly supplying China as the major producers, surpassing even Saudi Arabia as producers to China. Iran's now at 1.75 million barrels per day. We had them down around 300,000 a day. That's a massive difference. So we're already seeing America's enemies sort of fight these energy wars and establish their energy spheres of influence. And the one I think that would be the most interesting to the United States is India, which is, if the export license ban were to continue, they're under that because our free trade agreement with India expired. So I think getting American natural gas to India and converting those coal plants is both a way to bring India more into our realm as opposed to BRICS. But then also, I mean, the environmental advantages of that are going to be considerable for the world's, one of the world's largest polluters that wants to make that kind of a change. So I think massive opportunity in India, but also big risks with what's going on with Russia, China, and Iran.
Just on that Iran point, I imagine the Trump administration is going to take a more hawkish approach to Iran than the Biden administration has. If things are to heat up in the Strait of Hormuz, if tensions are to increase between the U.S. and Iran, I'm curious what effects might that have on global oil markets and global energy markets more generally?
Well, I think there's two things to think about immediately. First, we have significant strategic reserves, but they're important in that context. One reason is that the OPEC spare capacity on the books today has to traverse, a lot of it, the Strait of Hormuz. So when you ask where does the extra oil in the world come to market if we end up short because of sanctions, we end up short because of other interruptions, the answer is from government strategic stockpiles. But generally speaking, we have a lot of slack capacity in the oil market right now. And so there's not a lot of pricing in of the geopolitical risks you're describing.
Victoria brought up this really interesting point about India and the potential role of U.S. LNG when it comes to India. That's something we've done a lot of work on here at CSIS, is sort of the emissions reductions potential of climate policy in the world's largest democracy. I'm curious how you see sort of the convergence of climate beneficial policy, but also the intense geopolitical relationship that we have with that country and how we could potentially pull them away from Russia and other adversaries.
Sure. I mean, India is the leading case, but don't forget that much of Southeast Asia is the growth market for LNG as we look over the next 20 to 30 years. And U.S. having a more commercial presence there, it can be directly correlated with how we also experience geopolitical advantage. The thing that Victoria raises, to the extent to which can we replace coal plants, can we substitute for coal generation with LNG, is a matter of price and infrastructure. And the key challenge is not just going to be, can we deliver the LNG ships, but are there regasification units? Are there pipelines to generating facilities? And can we make a convincing case, take for the Indians for an example, that this is as secure a resource as the native coal resources would be? Or is it secure enough that the climate and environmental benefits that go along with using it can be realized? That's going to take a little bit, I think, of massaging, but the math can definitely pencil out if you do it right.
Victoria, do you think that the incoming Trump administration is prepared to make that case and wants to make that case of sort of the dual economic and environmental benefits of LNG, particularly in places like Joseph mentioned in South and Southeast Asia?
No, I absolutely think it's the case. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that the incoming administration is going to be more hawkish on Iran than our current leadership. So I think that's a very fair assessment. And it does demand I think, reevaluation of our security posture in the Gulf, which is still largely based on the Carter Doctrine of 1980. And then the circumstances now are so radically different. And so I think that needs a strong reassessment. But I do think that President Trump was rightly frustrated that the environmental gains of his first term were not well understood. And we were sort of branded as the enemies of the climate. And I think he's talked a lot on the trail about wanting to leave the earth cleaner than we found it, being responsible stewards. And so I do think that's a case he wants to make, and that we are much cleaner than China. That there has to be an honest accounting for what the carbon footprint actually is for these Chinese products. And that is something I would see them being very interested in.
I think Victoria's raised a really important point, because we have Republicans on Capitol Hill who've proposed to try to differentiate our goods at lower emissions intensity from imported goods competing with us at higher intensity. And the thinking is really about competition as well as climate. And the two travel in the same direction. Efficient energy can be clean energy, and clean energy can be more efficient. I would not be at all surprised. We have dared to suggest that such a thing, maybe it wouldn't be for the climate itself in the sort of the first instance, more the second, and commercial competition in the first instance, but that border adjustments are possible and maybe even likely in a world that is fragmenting along lines between a high emitting. If you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or for example, the BRICS countries, the emissions intensity of GDP in those countries is about 3.5 times what it is in the G7. So it's an opportunity for both commercial and climate benefit.
I think that this, if you kind of zoom out on that question of manufacturing intensity or the emissions intensity of economic production, you can even look at the oil and gas industry and try and see, is the climate agenda maybe more related to our strategic agenda than it has been in the past? Here I'm thinking about LNG to Europe. That's now the principal destination for a lot of U.S. LNG exports. U.S. LNG played a huge role keeping the lights on as they experienced that crisis over the last 2 years. The Europeans are standing up rules for the emissions intensity of LNG imports, particularly related to methane. This perhaps runs counter to the day one impulse of we're just going to get rid of all environmental regulation. I'm really interested to see how much this new administration sees the strategic imperatives it has on energy and the sort of evolving market conditions, 2025 being very different from 2017, impacting its regulatory agenda domestically.
Joseph, this is a really interesting point on LNG, and certainly when we talk about this topic, much of the focus is on Europe as a consumer. But as we also discussed, much of the energy demand in the future is going to be in East Asia. So I imagine that one of the things that the incoming Trump administration is going to be thinking about is what sort of LNG export industry are we building, and who are the customers in the future, and what will they demand? I imagine that the kind of climate considerations in Asia are a little bit different than they are in Europe.
They're absolutely different, but they're not absent. Right. I mean, you see efforts in Japan to have a better understanding of what these upstream methane emissions are. You see efforts to diversify the entire energy supply chain throughout Southeast Asia. So I don't think that they are, that there is some pragmatic global South that has an entirely different view from where the world has been going over the last few years. But the pragmatism still does rule. And I think the key thing in the U.S. is to see what we can do to leverage our resources, not just in natural resources, but in technology, in diplomacy, so that we can help the emerging markets develop as cleanly as possible.
Victoria, my sense was in the first Trump administration that there was a feeling that there was a clear difference between the U.S.'s strategic interests and global climate cooperation and global and climate initiatives. That's why we pulled out of the Paris Accord. Do you think, as Joseph described, in the second Trump administration, there might actually be a bit more convergence there, and that it may become in our strategic and economic interest to incorporate some of these climate considerations when it comes to the oil and gas industry, particularly when it comes to LNG exports?
Yeah, I think these two things are, as you said, converging naturally. I can tell you also with 100% degree of certainty that the United States is not going to remain in Paris, regardless of the impassioned pleas of our European allies to do so. But the whole point about Paris is it's not binding. And if it's not binding, then it doesn't actually get us to a more holistic climate solution. And so, my approach and Heritage's approach has been to try to get gains where we can that are practical, that are pro-human. And, I'm from Pennsylvania, so I'm particularly favoring export for terminals on the Atlantic. But for the reasons you enumerate, from East Asia, from Japan, from Taiwan, from other potential customers in that region, that we also need additional facilities on the West. But that these facilities are environmentally detrimental does not necessarily follow. My favorite candidate for an export facility on the Atlantic is Gibbstown, New Jersey, which would mean cleaning up an old DuPont munitions plant. You're dual purposing something, making an area that heaven knows needs some cleaning up much more environmentally friendly, achieving an export facility that we need. So I think that those kinds of projects are the ones they will be looking at that fulfill a number of different priorities.
Victoria, are you concerned that by stepping back from Paris or perhaps other sort of fora for cooperation on climate goals that we might miss out on market opportunities, sort of along the lines of methane and what the standards that the Europeans are setting out right now?
I really don't, because our product is so much cleaner, just inherently. If Europe wanted to go back to a early 2022 posture vis-a-vis other producers, that would really surprise me. As you said, almost a massive crisis. I don't know how much extra capacity, say, Qatar would have or Australia would have if countries chose not to import from us because we're not in Paris. I don't think that's really going to happen.
Kevin, can you talk a little bit about the other players that are significant in global LNG markets, and when we're talking about Qatar, when we're talking about Australia, when we're talking about Russia, how the U.S. can position itself competitively so that we are using this as an effective geopolitical tool and it's also economically beneficial to us?
Well, Quill, you mentioned Russia, which, as we all know, has gained market share in Europe, even though pipeline gas has declined significantly. And I suppose one question will be whether or not the Europeans are comfortable with that going forward. I think we all have to be sort of clear-eyed about what a settlement in Ukraine might mean. It might mean a restoration of commercial relations with Russia without sanctions or with reduced sanctions as part of that agreement. And so I'm not sure that we should assume that in the offing there's this intrinsic substitution of U.S. gas for Russian gas, although Ursula von der Leyen certainly made it sound like that might be in the offing. She made comments last week that she had talked to President-elect Trump and had said that she would be willing to buy more U.S. LNG, and the implication was also potentially for substitution for that increased Russian share of imports. But it's a global market, first of all, and second, there are questions about what European demand will bear. There are some forecasters who see a declining future for gas demand in fairly close at hand in Europe. There are others who say, well, wait a second, that's because of massive deindustrialization, which is what the Europeans have been trying to avoid. And what they would rather do is restore their industrial base. Depending on the shape of demand, there may be a lot of opportunity for all players.
Thanks, Kevin. So the Trump transition team recently came out with 3 goals that are really going to be the organizing principles for the incoming administration. That's first, to address inflation. Second, to win the AI arms race versus China. Third, to restore diplomatic strength to end wars. So, Joseph, we're talking about the U.S. oil and gas industry today and what this incoming administration is going to do. When it comes to this industry, how does it fit into these goals?
Clearly, the incoming administration sees the energy industry as at the heart of accomplishing all 3 of those things. We've already sort of talked about the geopolitical strength that can come from being a large energy exporter. How we convert that into ending wars, I think, is a longer and deeper conversation. For AI, it's clear that natural gas is going to play a very important role as a systems balancer in the United States, as part of our power system, and low prices in that context are going to be critically important. In terms of inflation, here I think that there are going to be real challenges in realizing the ambition, in part because U.S. producers struggle with low prices. A lot of the production gains that we see require a price floor. Kevin knows much more about the details of those things, or require not a price floor, but medium prices, or prices like we have today. A lot of our producers require prices similar to what we have today to really be as large and productive as they are. The things that lead to inflation in the energy system, whether that's the sort of grid investments or failures to build enough linear or downstream infrastructure, pipelines and refineries, that stuff's hard to resolve in the course of 2, 3, or even 4 years. So what kind of system we can build for the long term, I think, is going to be a really important question. It might be harder to tackle the immediate symptoms.
I think the easiest way to put it, Joseph, and I think President-elect Trump captured this on the campaign trail, the GPUs are going to need BTUs. It's going to take a lot of energy to energize, to power AI data centers. That's very clear now. I think everyone agrees the slope is up, whether it's a vertical line or whether it's a hockey stick or maybe something flatter is still to be defined. But right now, the natural gas resource we have is going to be the gap closer. And that's an asset. To the extent that you saw AI mentioned as one of the applications, one of the end-use sectors for the energy dominance goals of the National Energy Council and of Governor Burgum in his Interior Secretary designate role, I think is pretty important.
So, Victoria, how do you think that the U.S. oil and gas sector fits into these 3 goals? reducing inflation, winning the AI arms race, and also ending wars through diplomatic strength?
No, I think it's central, as both Joseph and Kevin said, to all three issues, because all three issues at the heart of them go to the burgeoning confrontation with China. As we've discussed, all year this year at Heritage, energy is the single greatest advantage that the United States has, along with the ingenuity of the American people. But the fact that we have gone from being a intensely energy vulnerable country in 1980, you look at all the reasons President Carter founded the Department of Energy in 1977, that he was so interested in the stability of the Gulf in 1980, all had to do with our energy vulnerability. That era has ended, and I don't think we've actually fully understood, what this means to us strategically and globally, especially as China, now our major competitor on the global stage, as opposed to Russia, which is another one of the big three producers. But China, is so vulnerable and is such a massive polluter. And they really can't solve that, even, with their play into civil nuclear, which is probably their best option. But they're still going to be intensely vulnerable. And particularly in the event of a kinetic war of some sort, that is something they're going to have to really struggle to solve. So I think it's central to all three. It was very smart, I think, for President Trump to talk about it the way he did on the trail. And, I think they could do a whole lot worse for a sort of guiding principle for the new administration.
The oil and gas industry will clearly have an ally in the White House come January. Last episode, we were talking about what the MO of the incoming Trump administration's energy policy was. Dave Banks proposed that it was build, baby, build, a little bit more expansive than drill, baby, drill. I'm curious, Joseph, after this discussion, we've clearly established the oil and gas is going to be very important. Do you think that the MO of the Trump administration's energy policy is build, baby, build? Or is it just drill, baby, drill, or maybe something else?
Not speaking for the administration, I think it's win.
Win.
I think it's, if you look at...
Not wind, just to be...
Yeah, win with wind. If you look at the criteria that they set out in Friday's announcement, I think it's pretty clear how we should be thinking about what their goals are, right? Like, there's articulate. Reduce inflation, win on AI, and regain diplomatic strength. And I think it's now incumbent to figure out what are the best strategies to accomplish all three of those things, not just over the next 4 years, but for the next 50.
I mean, it gets down to what we drill wells for. It's not just for the sake of drilling wells. It's for the end-use sectors that energy supplies. And that's still the focus. It's very obviously the focus. But it's not just here, right? As Victoria was pointing out, there's been a real change in our security posture. And it sounds sort of glib to say, well, from independence to dominance. But we're a 12, 13% net export share of consumption. China's a 25% net import share of consumption. Europe's in the 60s%. Korea, Japan, 95% plus. We have a real opportunity here globally to project soft power and also domestically to gain competitive advantage. The end-use sector is what it's all about. We're drilling for a reason.
I think one of the things that was also really interesting, just your comment reminded me, we spent so much time looking at the LNG industry over the last year post-Biden administration pause, which of course is going to be lifted rapidly. The nature of our market actors also helps, right? That the U.S., it lets a lot of energy exports be driven by market factors. We don't necessarily always take very strong political precisions. There's not always too much gamesmanship. And sort of as a supplier into global markets, that allows prices and other things to determine where exports go, that actually seems to be a really big, important, globally stabilizing force. It's a subtle difference maybe, but I do think it's important.
Victoria, final word to you. What's the MO of this incoming administration's energy agenda?
I like win. I think that rather than manage a decline or accept Chinese activities as inevitable and 100 feet high, I think that President Trump and the folks that he's named so far are much more interested in actually definitively winning this. And I think given the structural problems China has economically and demographically, if we can keep our wits about us, and I think, conversation like this from, a range of viewpoints is critical to that, we can do quite well.
Victoria, Joseph, Kevin, thanks so much for joining The Transition. Thanks so much for joining us on The Transition. We'll see you next episode.